podcast. And today I'm talking to Jennifer Reedy. Jennifer is a therapist and she's the founder of Peaceful Connections Therapy. I know Jennifer because you've come to some OutLoud events and you and I have talked a bunch. We've worked together and just chatted offline. And I'm really excited to talk to you about kind of, a therapist's view of obviously not being able to talk about clients' information, but things that you see, patterns that you see, and things that maybe can help. One of the things I find so useful about therapy is hearing that all my feelings are normal and that, the thing I'm worried about is shared by lots of other people. So yeah, I can't wait to dive into a bunch of the anxious thoughts that I have and feelings that I have that I think will be shared by other entrepreneurs and people in my audience, but also just get a sense of how you got into this work and what you think are some great self-care tips, options, and things that people can do to kind of stay, grounded and take care of themselves during this time. Because I know personally, I've been struggling a lot recently with COVID and everything. So yeah, I'd love to get into all that with you. And but first of all, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So yeah, first of all, you're in the States, right? You're based in Texas, is that right?
Austin, yeah.
Austin.
Mhm.
And so were you born in Austin?
No, I was born in Houston, moved
Okay.
around a lot as a kid, so I don't really. Austin would be the place I've lived the longest.
Okay. And so why did you move around so much when you were a kid?
My dad was in the oil field, so it was like boom bust. You move where the
Right.
oil was. Yeah.
What do you think? What did that do to you as a child, in your professional and personal opinion?
Oh, a lot of security issues. Being the new kid, like basically every year
Uh-huh.
was rough.
Every year,
So
so literally every year you'd move to a new school.
yeah, literally every year.
Wow.
Yeah.
Um, do you think? Yeah, I'm often interested in the idea between Nassim Nicholas Taleb has a phrase I think he uses called post traumatic stress and post traumatic growth. So
Mhm.
both are sort of outcomes of stress or trauma. And so do you feel that there were both good and bad effects of that had on you, like both stress disorder that you developed, but also was there growth as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think resilience is the biggest thing that comes out
Hmm.
from that. I've had, as an adult, a lot of issues that were struggles, but I had, you know, the tools that I developed as a kid, and teenager to fall back on, which I think was really helpful.
Right. Just knowing that even if everything was uprooted, you were going to be okay and you'd figure it
Yeah.
out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. And so what made you want to get into mental health care or being a therapist? I don't know how you describe it, but
Yeah. Mine started really, really early. In middle school, I don't know how it came up, but I was interested in psychology, and my parents bought me a psychology like college textbook, like abnormal psych. So it was just every weird disorder,
yeah.
and I just like devoured it and loved it. And so then there were like in high school, there was psychology, sociology, so I took those. So I was one of the very few people who went into college like knowing what I was gonna
Hmm.
major in, which is nice.
That's so interesting. And did you was this something you noticed in yourself and the relationships you'd have with people, that there was a tendency to pay attention to these things that maybe as young kids and teenagers we tend not to?
Yeah, and I think that the moving around probably did have a lot to do with it because I had to learn to read people really well and, you know, empathize with a lot of different types of people,
Mm,
moving like one year we moved from Michigan to Texas.
right.
Like that is culture shock.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean just kind of being able to fit in with whoever and understand all different kinds of people. And so I was the person that my friends would come to, and it's a lot of therapist stories.
Yeah. Yeah. Is that stereotype true that therapists are good listeners in their personal lives?
I think so. I mean, it's
Yeah.
something that if you, I mean, it's not across the board, but most
Yeah.
of the time, yeah, I would say.
Uh-huh. And so yeah, what do you think it is that you've learned how to do or that you had naturally, or obviously both probably, to make people feel comfortable to open up with you? Because I think that's a great skill that anybody can learn. Is for me as a coach, certainly I've learned that my work flirts and skirts the borders of therapy I try to make it really clear that I'm not a therapist and I'm not qualified in any way to give any kind of therapeutic treatment or advice, but that when we're talking about, as a public speaking coach, if I'm talking to somebody about what it is they want to say to the world and how they're afraid that they'll be perceived, and being vulnerable about the aspects of their story that are relevant to their business and I think they should share, or they want to share but they're not comfortable, all those sorts of things often play into past traumas or deep-seated negative thoughts. And so I've learned that asking questions is a very important tool, not to, tell them too much and be prescriptive, which I think is a principle of therapy. But yeah, what are some of the ways that people could be maybe a better listener that you've learned?
Yeah, I think for me at least, it really comes down to being absolutely not judgmental. Like whatever you come with,
Hmm.
I am going to hold that for you and hold that space for you. And, I have all different kinds of clients from all different backgrounds, and I accept them all exactly the same. And so I think that people, when that's genuine, people can feel that from you. And
Yeah.
then it speeds up the process of rapport and being able to open up.
Do you ever struggle with that? Do you ever hear something and you're like, holy shit, and you really have to try to remind yourself that to not judge? Do you ever struggle with that?
I'm trying to think of an example. I think because I really, really tap into everybody's humanness
Hmm.
and the struggle, because nobody is born with any of these sort of behaviors that are really detrimental. So I think because I can see possibly where things have come from,
Right.
it's helpful to
Yeah,
have it in perspective.
totally. I often think that the more I've read about psychology in my own like personal time, just for fun, and because I really like reading about psychology as well, the less judgmental I become.
Yeah.
The more you learn that like there are sort of patterns, and it's actually a lot of things are quite predictable. It seems like to me as an outsider, a lot of behaviors and responses are quite predictable once you learn about somebody's past experiences or situations that they're in or traumas. You can really start to understand and even predict lots of behaviors. And the more you learn about that, I find, the less judgmental you become, because you go, well, of course they're reacting in this way because they're dealing with this thing or they had that childhood experience. And so I often tell people, read about psychology to become um, a better leader and a better manager of your company. If you can treat your employee, instead of saying, "Oh, you messed up, you need to do better," think about, yeah, as you say, the human behind the person that's messing up, or the person who's giving you a hard time or a pain in your ass. Like, think about, there's probably something that they're going through that you have no idea about, and maybe starting there, or starting, like, trying to figure that out is um a lot more helpful. But I sometimes find, even though I believe in that, I agree with you, that I still struggle with that, to not judge people for doing things, especially if they affect me, right? If somebody's doing something that's making my life more annoying, it's a lot harder to like remember that they are, just a person and they're going through things. So I guess, yeah, there must be something too about not taking on energy as well, right? Like if somebody's in a, yeah,
Yeah. So also I want to clarify that I am a human, and in my own personal life, it's there I have struggles in that sense.
yes, right.
But when I'm as a therapist in the professional chair like that, because it doesn't affect me. That's the thing.
Hmm.
I have the boundaries. I've learned to build the boundaries. So they really have their own process. It's not my story. And so yeah, I don't have the issue because it doesn't affect me. But outside of my life, like in my personal life, that
Yeah.
definitely is more of a struggle. So
And so when you're sitting in, but what's interesting is, like, when you're sitting in the room with someone, one thing I find difficult, like let's say in my relationship, or with a family member, is if you're living with somebody and you're with them, or even if you're just not even living with them, just temporarily with them, like if I'm with my sister or something, um, their energy can affect you, right? Like if somebody's at a high anxiety level and they're like, oh, well, we got to do this. We got to pick this up. You start to feel your own heart rate kind of racing and your own breath catching. And you're like, you start to take on their energy. So as a therapist, do you have tools to not let, if somebody's kind of in crisis right in front of you, or if their breathing is belabored or they're kind of freaking out, for lack of a better word, on the couch, like what do you do to make sure that doesn't affect you vicariously?
Yeah, and this is for everybody. You need psychological boundaries. And so what
Mm,
that entails is having it's the line between your psychology, your inner self, and the world or another person's. And so you have to know that it's benevolent and respectful to allow other people to have their process. And the only things that need to come through that boundary are things that are about you and things that are true. And so if this person's like spiral is not about you, then it doesn't pass the test to come
mm.
into space. That
So
be
if it's not about you and it's not true, then you
Mhm.
don't need to let it affect you.
Right.
Mm,
And that is a muscle you have to build. It's
yeah.
not something you do overnight. Practice, practice, practice. But once you can do that, your life is so much calmer because
Mm,
you're not a sponge absorbing everybody's energy that you interact with.
right. Do you ever find that that sometimes gets you in trouble? Because one thing I've also noticed is that sometimes when I practice this thing of going, I'm going to let this person have their feelings and I'm not going to like meet them. I'm not going to let them like kind of pull me to where they're at. That sometimes you can be accused of like lack of empathy or lack of caring. So sometimes I find, again, whether it's in a relationship or with a close person or even an interaction, like sometimes I get in a like a altercation like with my dog at the dog park, somebody's upset about something and I'm just kind of working on staying calm, they almost get more upset because they're like, why don't you care about this, or or why aren't you feeling the way I'm feeling? Do you ever kind of get in trouble with that in your personal life because you're probably really really good at staying calm, you know maintaining your equilibrium? Do you ever get accused of being unfeeling or
No, because you pair it with empathy. So you're not like in a bubble that you don't reach out from. Like you can reach out with comfort, you can reach out with, statements of empathy, offers to help in a way that doesn't require you to solve the problem or take on their energy. So it's a
right?
balance, but you can definitely reach out from your boundary to offer care and support.
So
It's
like
more about like the emotion that comes through.
right. So kind of boundaries with empathy. Um,
Absolutely.
what would you say that if somebody listening to this is dealing with a particularly onerous person in their lives, what would some of those practical ways of keeping your boundary, but also reaching out with empathy? What would some of that look like in action?
Give me an example of what kind of onerous? There's a lot
So,
of different.
yeah, totally, totally. Um, for example, okay, one thing I deal with, not deal with a lot, but one thing that definitely irks me a lot is when I'm dealing with a passive aggressive person. So somebody who I know they have a problem, and I know that they are not stating it. I feel like I'm sufficiently, um, you know, observant enough to know this person's not happy and they're upset about something, but they're not saying it. Um, what would you say is the best way to try to address that if this person is not even saying kind of what's on their mind? How would you kind of deal with that?
I think that what's important to understand is a boundary is not about trying to change anybody else's behavior.
Hmm.
It's only about your own process.
Okay.
So they're allowed to be passive aggressive. That's part of their process, and that's benevolent and respectful to allow them to have that, whatever that means, whatever feelings they're
Mm.
having. And so you kind of just ground yourself in that moment and say, internally, I've done what I can do. I've left the door open for honest communication. And, you know, they take the ball from there. And
And if they're not reciprocating, there's nothing I can do about that.
right, you
Right.
can't control anybody else's behavior,
Right.
even if we have an illusion that we can.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's also something I find quite frustrating is like I'm willing to be quite open and honest. Obviously, I think. I mean, who knows? I'm probably giving myself too much credit, but I always feel like I'm open. I'm willing to have a conversation. I'm willing to admit that I'm wrong. I'm willing to sort of see other points of view. But then sometimes I get frustrated when other people don't grant me the same, let's say, like sort of, the meet me halfway concept. One thing I'm learning more and more, but I find so hard, is the idea of taking 100% responsibility for your own emotions. And even something that I teach is like taking responsibility 100% for the success of a conversation that you have.
Mhm.
So literally, I think I kind of play around with this a lot with when I get into conflict in work, or if there's a particularly tricky thing that I'm navigating in my relationship or with a family member or something, and going, okay, have I honestly tried everything to make this better? And usually the answer, if it's gone wrong, usually the answer is no. And if I go back to it and try harder, I can usually fix it. And so that's something I'm working with a lot. But then I find the problem that comes up sometimes is resentment.
Mhm.
And so I go, okay, I just successfully navigated this train wreck. I got it back on the rails,
Mhm.
but now I feel hard done by or unrequited, unreciprocated. Do you have any tips for dealing with this specific problem that I have?
I'm curious about your understanding of being responsible for the success of the conversation, like what your definition of success would be.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. So, for example, if I'm fighting with my wife, and the success of the conversation is we've got, let's say, an errand to run, and one of us thinks that the other should do it, and so if the successful conversation is one in which we solve the problem while being as calm, respectful, and everything of each other, and not letting it devolve into a fight, and making sure the errand gets done and we stay happy and respectful and kind to one another. So that's kind of like, let's say that's a common situation I come into. Thing needs to get done and I want to solve it in the best possible way without a fight.
But that's you taking on the other side of the conversation, and that's not your responsibility. And that's why you feel resentful because you're taking on something that isn't yours to take on.
Hmm.
Because you can't keep your wife from getting angry or raising her voice. Like you're not in charge of that. And when you like bend over backwards to try to like keep that from happening, like of course you're like putting in way more effort than she is, and then you're gonna feel resentful about that.
Hmm. So you would say that having the attitude of taking 100% responsibility for a conversation, maybe at least not devolving into a fight, is taking on too much.
Yeah, I would say you can take on 100% of your part of the conversation,
Hmm.
your side of the conversation,
Right.
absolutely. And the way that you express yourself and the way that you regulate your emotions, like that is all you and your responsibility.
Right.
So if your measure of success is that you kept your cool, you used I statements and explained your point of view in the best way that you knew how without, whatever your idea of a fight is, raising your voice, using angry words, whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
then, you know, I think that would be a realistic expectation of success or definition.
Right. So the point is not keeping everybody from yelling or using angry words. The point is just keep yourself from doing that, and then letting go of the behavior of anyone else.
Right. Because in
Right.
the end, whatever happens with her, if all you've done is your work, then you don't really have any reason to be resentful.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that makes a whole lot of sense. I think I often take on, as somebody who's interested in psychology, interested in mental health work, and a communication coach. I often take on too much, and say, okay, I have a the power to make sure that every single interaction I have can go well. And not only can I make myself act in a way that I want, but I can make other people, because I, have these observations and this knowledge and this practice skill set that I've developed over many years. But of course, that also is kind of taking away agency from other people and not letting them be who they are and react the way they want to, which I guess is not very ethical, even by itself, is it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a big part is letting people have their own process. And
Hmm.
your wife might be like super pissed off that you're asking her to do this errand, and she's allowed to be,
Totally. Yeah.
whether or not you find it justified, like she's allowed to have her feelings about it.
Uh-huh. Now that brings me to an interesting thing, and this is just something I've noticed recently. Is yeah, this idea of sort of letting people have their feelings versus like trying to set your own boundaries for the way they're talking to you.
Yeah.
So I know a lot of people struggle with, certainly if they're in a subordinate position at a workplace, or if they feel like being talked to in a way that feels dismissive, belittling, demeaning, humiliating, that can really, really fester and really disrupt people's happiness and well-being at work, right? I'm sure you hear that all the time from people who feel they're being spoken to like that. So how do you set a boundary to tell somebody that it is not okay the way you're talking to me, or do that while still kind of, um, taking responsibility for your own kind of actions in that way, or letting them have this idea of letting them have their feelings? How do those two kind of reconcile?
Yeah, so those are actually two different types of boundaries. So
Hmm.
there are four different kinds of boundaries. So there's physical boundaries, which is what you will and won't accept physically.
Hmm.
Psychological boundaries, which we talked about. Containing boundary, which is your ability to like contain your own reactions, like the space between an emotion and a behavior.
Sorry, can you explain a bit more about that?
Yeah. So basically, if somebody's blowing up all of the time, then they do not have a very strong containing boundary.
Oh, I see. So if you're angry but you don't have any lid on it, then there's a soft or a weak containment barrier there. If you're angry but able to kind of express it calmly, then you have a strong containment barrier,
Right.
sort of thing. Okay,
Mhm.
great.
Yeah. And then the last one that you were talking about would be an executed boundary. And that's where you let people know what you will and won't expect. So
Wi-
like, or
to
accept, not
accept,
expect.
right? Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So, there's steps to that, how to, set those boundaries.
Hmm.
And we can go through that if you want, or we can
That
keep
would be
talking
cool.
about it.
I would love to. I mean, I don't know if I guess I'm a bit of a psychology nerd or therapy nerd in a way, but I like to kind of promote that as much as possible. I think therapy and mental health work is probably one of the most important things that anyone can do, but particularly for entrepreneurs, because, as you go, so does your business, which is what an associate of mine says. And just the idea being, the more of self-care and self-discovery and forgiveness and letting go and all these things that we work on in therapy that you do as an entrepreneur, I believe the better leader and founder and, advocate for your company, advertiser and investment fundraising and manager and all those roles that you have to play as your company, not to mention friend, husband, wife, family member, that, the better you'll be able to be at all those roles. So yeah, I would love to go into this because I think it's really, really interesting. So the steps to create an executed boundary.
Yeah. So, and really, I have to say that this is based on the work of Jules Taylor Shore.
Hmm.
But I don't want to take credit for I didn't invent this.
Sure, sure, yeah, yeah.
um,
Jules Taylor Shore.
yeah,
Okay, cool. We can link to her work at the end of this video,
yeah, that would be
or
amazing
yeah, put
because
some links.
everybody needs this. So there are 6 steps. The first step is to figure out why the boundary is important to you and good for you based on your values, which is super helpful for figuring
Mhm.
out like what your motivation is to help you
So
have
the
more.
idea being, so sorry. Sorry, please.
So just more strength, because if somebody's having trouble setting boundaries, sometimes they need a little sort of help. Backbone isn't the right word, but like support and internal support to be able to do that. So knowing like I am setting this boundary because it's in line with these values that I hold.
Right. So for example, I have sorry to stop us right after we've reached the first
Yeah.
one, but I have trouble sometimes setting a boundary around, or whether or not to set a boundary around, let's say somebody who I kind of know, who I feel is talking to me in a way that I don't like. I have trouble understanding, is this a pride and an ego thing, particularly like a male thing where I'm just like, you know, don't fucking talk to me like that, because it's getting my back up. Or is this something that's important for me to flag and say, hey, listen, I really don't appreciate being spoken to like that, because it's part of a deeper issue. Like, is it something I can let slide because it's not worth getting into a confrontation about it? Or is this something that is really, really important that I flag and say, hey, listen, this is not okay. So I guess that's, yeah, that would be my first question is, so you have to figure out your values and say, okay, one of my values is like, let's say, be honest, even when it's uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, I could say, hey, listen, I don't appreciate the way you're talking to me right now, even though that's going to make the conversation super awkward. I
Well,
can,
this isn't something that you have to do in every situation.
right.
If it's somebody that you are not going to interact with that often, and it's not something that you know, you're going to really need to come back to this issue, then you can let it go. If it's like an acquaintance that you're going to see like once a year, it's probably not worth the
Mm,
work to
right.
do. You know what I mean?
But then wouldn't what if the value is, I want to try to be um, as clear as possible and as consistent as possible with everybody I meet? Or if failing, because sometimes I find failing to set boundaries makes me ashamed of myself later on, you
Yeah.
know?
Well, yeah. And so if that's something that happens for you and it feels like this is, something that's worth it, but I'm sure that you have a lot of a lot of values, not just being honest. And so you kind of have
Yeah,
to look at the range
right.
to be like, what else do you value that?
Not being brutally mean to people is also a value. Yeah, so
Right. I mean,
sometimes
so
that clashes with honesty.
for a lot of
Yeah,
people, picking your battles is a value.
right.
So this may be a pick your battles kind of situation.
Hmm. Okay, cool. Sorry, I just find this also interesting, which is why I keep getting stuck
Yeah.
on each point.
No.
But okay, so first step of creating a good executed boundary is figuring out why the boundary is good for you in
Mhm.
line with your values, and sort
Yeah.
of reminding yourself of that, or getting somebody else, to like a therapist, to help you with that. What is number two?
Number two is figuring out what you will say. So like what is the boundary going to be and how will you say it? And it should be clear, concise. So you don't want to, you know, have a monologue about
Yeah,
it. Just as short and sweet as possible. And in a kind way, you're not wanting to, you know, dictate to somebody in a way that's going to turn them off. You want to try to collaborate as much as you can. So you can even say something like, I know that you love me very much. I love you too. I want this to, go in a positive direction. And this is the boundary that I'm setting.
right. That makes a lot of sense. Being clear on what you're going to say too, I think, can help people get over the nerves, that come with having an uncomfortable moment. I think, especially, I don't know, I think you'd probably say the same about American culture, but certainly in Canadian culture, politeness as a virtue and as a social custom is so important, that to come out, especially if you're not the only two people there, but even if you are, to come out and say, I don't like what you're doing, can be like shocking. It sends these little ripples of like, oh my God, around the group. I see this all the time. And not until I left Canada did I really start to see how sensitive social groups are to anybody rocking the boat and saying, listen, I'm not okay with this. Or listen, I don't
Yeah.
like how you're talking to me right now. Or I don't like what you did. it really, a lot of people just don't know how to handle it. So yeah, I think having an idea of what you're going to say, and again, trying to say it as politely and compassionately and kindly and collaboratively as possible is great, because then that courage that it takes to stand up in front of the group and go, no, I'm gonna plant a flag here, or I'm gonna say something and rock the boat for a second.
Mhm.
I think that's great advice. What's number 3?
So number 3 is to anticipate the pushback. So assuming that the person that you're setting the boundary with is going to come back with something like, yeah, but,
Hmm.
you know, whatever it is.
Yeah, that's really smart. I often tell people too, in terms of like, this is sort of like an intellectual exercise. But if you're trying to make the case, let's say if you have a pitch as a founder, if you're trying to make the case for why this new way of, doing systems management software, whatever, is better, think of all the arguments against it. What could people say? Not from your perspective, but from their perspective. What would be the problem with that? Like, why won't it work? What could go wrong? What are you not seeing? And excuse me, like really explore all the pushback. And I think that's really, really good emotionally as well, to go, why would people have a problem with this, and what might they say?
Yeah.
Awesome. Number 4.
So number 4 is to anticipate what your emotional reaction will be to the pushback.
Oh, nice.
So are you
Yeah.
going to be angry? Are you going to be hurt? Like, what do you think you're going to feel from the pushback or in response to the pushback?
What will be your counter pushback?
Right. Yeah.
But I guess not necessarily spoken out loud, but
Maybe
emotional
internally.
response. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. And yeah, what's number 5?
Number 5 is, what is your plan to soothe yourself when you have that reaction?
I imagine breathing is a really, really good one. Do you have any others?
I mean, sometimes taking a break, just, you can excuse yourself to the restroom, like whatever you need to do to take a second out of the space
Hmm.
to kind of calm, because sometimes the air is so charged, it's hard to.
Yeah. Do you ever? I think that's good advice. Sometimes it must feel like a big move to leave the room for a lot of people. That
Yeah, and
they'll.
if you explain it though, if you
Uh-huh.
say like, so it's getting kind of charged, like give me a second, I want to go like cool off for a second and come back, and we can revisit this. So it's not like a stomping off
Yes.
anger,
Right. Right.
you know.
That's great advice. Yeah, to kind of to say why you're doing something, and to not just say, like, to storm off. Yeah, because storming off or walking out in the middle of a thing can seem almost as antagonistic as sticking around and yelling.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. And what's the final step?
The final step is, how in the face of all that pushback are you going to hold the boundary, which is the really hard part.
Yeah. So it almost feels like the first 2 are preparatory work, and the last 4 are like in the moment work. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
So you start by going, okay, what's my boundary going to be? And I guess that the only way you can do this is when something's kind of happened once or twice already. Somebody said something to you, or something keeps happening at work. And I'm just going to keep this kind of in the workplace for now, because I'm sure there's a whole different dynamic when it's your spouse or a family member or a friend. But um, so let's say somebody at work keeps cutting you off when you're trying to say something.
Mhm.
So then you go, okay, how do I set a boundary here? First of all, do I need to, or is it something I can live with? Uh, that's a fair kind of example, sort of
Yeah,
going, okay,
definitely.
yeah,
Yeah.
is it important for me to push back against this, or set this boundary rather, and say, actually, I want to be heard here, and I don't want you to keep cutting me off. Then the second thing is, okay, what will I say to get that across? Sorry, you just cut me off, and I know you have something to say, and it's exciting and we're collaborating, but I just want to make sure I get my point out, something like that.
Hold on though. Did you skip the value part?
Oh, right. So why this boundary is good for my value. So yeah, well, what would you say to somebody? I think most people would assume that getting cut off is contrary to their values in general, but like, how do we? I mean, what this skips, unfortunately, number one is like, how do you know which values are important to prioritize in your life in the first place, right? How do we know whether it's better to be conflict averse and keep the peace, or better to say something and create a boundary for yourself? Because I often feel that those two things are at odds. Like, I often want to be very upfront and clear, and then sometimes I get in trouble because I'm seen as confrontational. Other times I feel like I want to keep the peace, and then I realize I really should have said something there, because I abdicated a pretty important responsibility to either save somebody's feelings, or stick up for someone, or stick up for myself. So how do you decide in the first place which of those values to prioritize? And do you think there's just those big two, or yeah, how do you look at that?
I mean, for the most part, I think if it's something that either is an ongoing issue that you need to resolve, that would be a place to really look closely to see if it's something you want to set, and probably is.
So if it happens
Um,
more than once or twice.
yeah, I mean, if it's something that within a relationship that you need to address, and I mean, generally these are within a relationship, so it's not like at a party somebody spills a drink on you
Yeah,
and doesn't apologize. Like that's
right.
not really what we're talking about here. This is a
But like a
relationship.
colleague who's a colleague who keeps interrupting you. Somebody
Yeah.
who I've heard of this a lot. I know it's a stereotype, but certainly it's something I hear a lot. And I don't know if you've experienced this quite a bit, but men interrupting women. And so a woman who will be in a group, and then she's saying something, and a man will just kind of come in, and it seems pretty clear he doesn't realize he's doing this. He's not doing it to be malicious, but it's something that she wants to stop. So I get this a lot. I had this a lot from my female clients. Um, so yeah, they how what would you say to, I guess, a female patient of yours, who reports something like this, in terms of, should I just, deal with it and pick my battles, or should I say something?
So this intersects with my ideals and values about equality and feminism and all of that. And because I work with women, issues like that come up a lot, those sort of topics. And so
Mhm.
um, I would be encouraging her to explore like what the dynamics are at her work and what she wants them to look like, and what would be um, what's kind of going into her up to this point not standing up and saying something, and kind
Mm.
of like doing some background processing of her, the kind of stuff around that.
Right. Interesting. So kind of, instead of looking at it as an isolated incident, think about it, maybe there's something, I don't know if cultural is the right word, but yeah, maybe cultural, that's stopping her from doing it, or it's making the guy do it in the first place, or looking at, I guess, the broader context of why is this happening, and why is it so hard to deal with.
And
I
I think
guess,
it
yeah.
also correct.
No, no, I was just gonna say, I guess that's what you're saying.
Yeah, and it helps sort of to tease out the values part of it also, because that definitely can be a value, is to be heard and to be respected and
Hmm.
be an equal player at the table.
But I would think that everybody would have that value, right? Everybody would probably have the value of, I want to be heard and I want to be respected, but some people have a broken gauge of how valued or respected they are, how heard they are or not, right? Um,
I think also it has to do with um, how people are socialized.
hmm,
Women in particular, they may not even feel worthy of taking their place at the table.
right,
So they may not even identify that as a value because they haven't even considered standing up in that way.
right. Would you find that? Yeah, do you find that, with women, that there is a sense of defaulting maybe to conflict aversion, because of maybe the sense of being conditioned to not, want to take up space, or make themselves heard, or fight for a voice? Like, do you think that maybe women too often will choose peace kind of over violence, and therefore And do you think that that has a lot of consequences in terms of like not being able to speak up?
Yes, I mean, I can't say 100%, but very, very often that's an issue, and it
Sure.
definitely affects women's, you know, career and
Confidence and
lives in general. Yeah.
yeah, right. So so once you've kind of done, which I'm sure is not as simple as just saying it, but once you've kind of done some work to unpack that and kind of go, okay, this may be the broader context, this may be where you learned it from a young age, or this may be, and that this has happened and this plays out in many different ways, and then figuring out, okay, my value is to be heard, therefore, I want this guy to stop interrupting me when I'm talking.
Mm.
Then number two is because my value is to be heard, and because this is coming against that. Number two, what I'm going to say, hey, as kindly and compassionately as you can. I know you're really excited. I just want to finish my point here. Then you have to anticipate. Oh, I guess all of this is a plan, right? All of this is work you do beforehand.
Yeah. So,
Okay,
yeah, you don't actually go into the conversation to set the boundary until you have gone through all of these steps enough
right.
to where you say, I feel ready
Ah,
to go and set this boundary.
is I guess it's because if you don't have all these plans in place, you might just react from emotion and be make it worse or ratchet up the stakes or something. But if you have a plan, you can kind of be more calm about it.
Yeah. Or the opposite. I mean, in the face of the pushback, you might just shrink back and then feel like you failed and you're, even
Right.
less confident the next time it comes up.
Uh-huh. Yeah, because you already kind of wasted your chance to set the boundary in your mind by not holding it. Okay, so let's just keep working through this example then, if you don't mind. So, the likely pushback from that might be, "Oh, what's the big deal? We're all talking here. You interrupted me, or why you got to make it weird, or whatever that is."
Mhm.
Then you can think through all those and go, okay, well, he might say this, he might say that, they might say this. Or one thing I like is the concept of steel manning. Again, this is more of an intellectual than less of an emotional thing, but the kind of the difference between straw manning and steel manning is straw manning is where you're arguing with someone and you attack a like kind of fake version of their argument that's easy to destroy. So if
Mhm.
you're fighting with a loved one and you're like, so you're saying I'm just always rude to you, and then that's a straw man. But steel manning their argument is really trying to think of, okay, what are you actually saying? What's the best version of your argument that I can kind of repeat back to you to show that I'm hearing you? So not just doing it from a way of like, oh, he might say this stupid thing, and then I'll be there with this great thing, but really trying to think, well, what might he legitimately or understandably push back on? Going like, well, hey, I'm sorry, I'm just excited, or we're all there, and kind of trying to do it without mocking, I guess, or without um yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to anticipate both if you think that the person may come with both, because
Yeah.
I mean, there are definitely people in our lives who would come with the straw man approach, and
Yeah.
you need to be able to center yourself and calm yourself in the face of that also, because that can be infuriating.
Totally. Yeah, if somebody's coming at you with just a ridiculous point, it's and some people do this probably if not consciously on purpose then unconsciously. They'll come at with a ridiculous argument in order to draw you into going, "Oh, that's so stupid," and then getting off track.
Mhm.
So yeah, I guess preparing yourself for both good and bad pushback. Um, then what will be your emotional response to the pushback? And I would guess that by preparing yourself for it ahead of time, a lot that's probably likely to be less so than it would be if you were unprepared for it.
I mean, ideally, but not always, in the
Uh-huh.
moment of a difficult conversation, it can be, that's why we have the next step, which is to calm yourself, because you still will probably have some kind of response to it.
And probably they might come out with something that, because I've done similar work to this before where I've gone, okay, I'm going to go into a really high conflict scenario. and I know what they're going to say, or I know what they're likely to say. But then I've failed to take into account certain things they said, and then I stuck to my plan until they said that thing that I never thought about, and I had no, step 4 or 5 uh, part of my plan, and I just went, okay, you said this. Well, here's my calm counter rebuttal. You said this. Okay, I was expecting that. Here's this. And then somebody goes, well, what about this? And you're like, oh, and then you fly off the handle because
Yeah.
you weren't expecting it. So I guess you have to be prepared that they might say something that you've never even thought of that could make you feel a certain way.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And then to continue with this, how to soothe yourself. So as we said, breathing or maybe standing up and leaving the room, but kind of talking, saying why you have to do it and being as kind of honest and transparent, but respectful as possible. For me, the breath is such a powerful tool in general. Like today when I came on to talk to you, I was almost like, oh, I'm so glad to talk to Jennifer because I'm feeling really anxious today. And I can even hear it and feel it in my breath. And it's days like this where I'm working really hard. I'm constantly trying to solve problems. I'm also coaching people. So the energy that I get into when I'm coaching is up here. And it's like, okay, great. And let's do this and let's do that. And let's really, really, my dog shares my tendencies as well. Um, and then I just notice I'm not breathing deeply at all. And if I just stop and go, okay, and I try not to make it a big deal or anything, but it just taking a small breath and waiting. And it's such cliched, cheesy advice, but it really does work. Just having that come back in your mind, or like, oh yeah, well, what about this? And just going, and then talking. I mean, for me, I know that works so well. Um,
And I should mention that the boundaries kind of are on a stepping sort of situation. So there's physical boundaries. You have to have the physical boundaries, physical feeling of safety before
mhm,
you can move on to building psychological boundaries.
right.
And then once you have the psychological boundary, you're able to move on to the containing boundary. So if you have a good containing boundary, that makes that step
Right.
easier.
And so yeah, so I guess you could say that knowing how to soothe yourself is a form of containment boundary.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
it is the most important part of that. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. And then the last thing is how to hold the boundary. And again, that is a plan of what to say, I
Mhm.
guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it could be restating what you said before. It could be paraphrasing it in a different way. It could be, if you continue along this line, I'm going to have to exit this conversation or hang up the phone or whatever it is.
Hmm. Right.
So you may have to step it up, or you may just have to restate it
Hmm.
and have to feel it out and see.
Now, I would wonder about a step 7, which is, and again, this may be a very Canadian question, but how to get things back on track. Let's say everything is successful, or even maybe not as successful as you'd like, but you still have to continue your meeting. So then how would step 7 to me, my question would be, how do I get things back on track? How do you segue back into okay, so what we were saying was,
Mhm.
I guess, what
Yeah,
would be
and
your
it's
advice around that? Once you've had this moment where you're like, I'm going to set a boundary, I'm going to say something that's going to get awkward. How do you then transition back to a healthy, productive dialogue?
so it's important to understand that setting a boundary is never again about controlling the other person. So they may not respond in a way that allows for things to go back to comfortable,
Hmm.
especially not right away. So, like knowing that going in, is this something that I need to set in the middle of the meeting, or is this something we need to talk about after the meeting?
Right. That's another very, very good point, which I didn't think about, is that certainly, and I have to say, I learned a lot from watching this reality TV show that my wife and I watch called Below Deck. It's like this great
Yacht
trashy
thing?
reality. Yeah, have you seen it?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. And so one thing I really like about it, and I actually tell people to people who have a disgust for reality TV, as I even still do, even though there's a lot of shows I like now. is to say you can actually learn a lot of just about social dynamics if you watch it with this eye. And one thing that is great about Below Deck is that you're basically watching people in this work environment. They're cramped together, they're living together, they're working together. There's no room. They're working long hours, so you get to see these kind of office corporate hierarchy, roommate slash workplace things play out, and also romantic partners and chain of command. You get to see these things play out, and you get to kind of put yourself through that simulator and go, oh, well, what should that person have done in that situation? What would I do, and how would I react? And one of the biggest things I always see is it sometimes can be really bad to have something out in front of the group,
Hmm.
because people get super defensive when they feel like they're being watched and their status is on the line. So it's like, if you could just take that person aside and say, listen, when you did that thing, it really bothered me. It could be so much better than being like, hey, I just want to address this now. You did this and I really didn't like it. Then everybody kind of, it gets so much more high stakes. So
Yeah.
yeah, what do you think about that? Do you have a kind of rule about that, or idea about like confronting somebody in the moment where something happens, or waiting till later in private?
Well, I think the whole idea about planning it ahead of time is giving yourself the opportunity to pick your moment.
Right.
And so, like you said, Thanksgiving dinner is probably not the best time to come out with this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Behind closed doors, when you have a private moment, allow somebody to be vulnerable because they're not, and maybe accept and hear what you're saying,
Because they
better
don't have
than
to, they don't have pride, or they don't have to save face or defend themselves,
right.
in front of a group. Yeah. I sometimes feel like if I don't say something in the moment, it becomes harder later. But then I have done in my career, I've had moments where I've had to talk to people, and I found a lot more success when I've waited and said, hey, come have a coffee with me or something, and just say, I just want to talk to you about this.
Yeah.
This bothered me, and I just wanted to say why, and just let you know. And also, one tip that I've found, I don't know how you feel about this, or whether you would say this, is like letting somebody know, not because you're telling them you need to change this behavior, but almost doing it like, I'm telling you this because I thought you'd want to know that this is going on,
Hmm.
almost from that spirit of like, I want to let you know that this is bothering me, so that you have all the information. Because most of the time, if you find out you've been offending someone or hurting someone's feelings, or bothering them, and you realize you've been doing this for like weeks, you're like, shit, I wish I'd known, so that I could not do it. I wouldn't have done it if I had known. So it's almost an act of kindness and respect to let somebody know that they're bothering you, if done correctly.
Yeah. I mean, I think, especially if the person is the kind of person that would take that in a healthy way and,
Yeah,
reflect.
true. I guess not everyone is. I mean, but I tend to, one thing I also find helpful, even if it's naive and maybe inaccurate, is that I tend to feel that everybody is kind of doing their best
Hmm.
with
I
what
agree
they've
with that.
got. And even if you think they're not, they probably are. And even if they are not, even if they are actively being malevolent and disruptive because they just don't care, or they actually like it, or they want to leave their job and they're trying to get fired, whatever the case may be, approaching every confrontation or potential confrontation or situation or conversation with, everybody here is doing their best, and let's figure that out. I find that really really leads to way more, again, successful conversations, but just success being a solution to a problem reached with the least amount of resentment, bitterness, and hurt feelings caused as possible.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that everybody is doing the best they can with what they know and what
Hmm.
their history is and what they have or haven't worked on in
Yeah,
regards to that.
and that's another thing too. Like, sometimes it's hard. I have to stop myself from looking down on people who don't have, let's say, an emotional tool that I've learned, because I know that, first of all, my parents were quite pro therapy and feelings, let's say. So I was raised with a healthy kind of um, emotional education, I guess you'd call it. And then also I've been lucky enough to be able to afford and access therapy for a couple of years now.
Yeah.
So um, I have to kind of remind myself of that I'm not better than this person because I know this kind of psychological phenomenon that they've never been exposed to. I just was lucky enough to learn it. So looking down on them or getting mad at them or yeah, is not going to help anything, because if they knew it, then probably this wouldn't be an issue. And if they were lucky enough to have known it, then again. So yeah, I think that's a really, really good insight. And I think we have to leave it there, unfortunately, because I just want to be respectful of your time, and I got to go too. But I feel like we could just keep talking for like another 2 hours. I'd love to do a part two with you if you're interested.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this stuff is so useful to unpack. Obviously, we'll see what kind of the reaction is from people and if they resonate with it. But I don't know. I find this stuff so. Um, First of all, I relax after I talk about emotions, especially with a professional and somebody like you who has such great insights about these different problems and useful tips, but also just yeah, the practical advice that this kind of thing gets you. It reminds me of The Sopranos when Tony is going to quit his therapist and she gives him an idea about how to deal with his mother, but he actually uses it on his uncle to like take the blame from the police, and he positions his uncle with this idea. And then his wife goes, "So you're not quitting therapy?" And he's like, "No, I get a lot of good ideas from there." And you realize he's using it to be like a better mob boss. But I do think that therapy can like give you great tools for business and not just for emotional work, but you can really learn so much about yourself and other people. So I'm going to keep promoting it in my circles. But yeah, I would love to have you back on.
Awesome. Yeah. Anytime.
Yeah.
Just let me know.
And if people are interested in your work, where can they find you?
So my website is peacefulconnectionstherapy.com, and I'm on Instagram at Peaceful Connections Therapy, I believe.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, you post some great stuff, and yeah, I really like the way that you approach this work and the way you break it down. So thanks so much, Jennifer. And yeah, look forward to talking to you again soon.